The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath as the doors near the entrance opened wider, but before anyone reached the man everyone had been waiting for, my thoughts drifted somewhere entirely different. It is strange how the heart protects itself. Faced with another quiet humiliation, it often reaches backward instead of forward. Sitting alone at the far table, I found myself remembering a much smaller room, a tiny apartment we had rented during our first year of marriage. Richard had been 28, ambitious, nervous, and convinced that hard work could change everything. We owned a second-hand couch, a scratched kitchen table, and exactly 4 dinner plates that never matched. Every Friday evening we celebrated surviving another week with takeout hamburgers and vanilla milkshakes because they were affordable luxuries. Back then Richard used to look at me as though I was the reason he believed tomorrow would be better than today. I believed it too. When he decided to leave his stable accounting job to join a struggling manufacturing company, everyone warned him against it. His parents thought he was making a terrible mistake. His friends quietly searched for openings they could recommend after what they assumed would be an inevitable failure. I was the only person who never asked him to play it safe. I worked longer hours at the public library, accepted every weekend shift I could find, and postponed my own graduate degree because somebody needed to keep steady money coming into the apartment. Richard apologized more than once for asking me to wait. I always answered the same way. We are building one future, not 2 separate lives. Those words became the foundation of everything we owned. When our first child was born, Richard traveled constantly for work while I learned to repair leaky faucets, replace broken light switches, and stretch every grocery dollar until payday. Some evenings I fell asleep in the rocking chair beside the crib because I was too exhausted to walk upstairs. Richard would come home after midnight carrying flowers from airport gift shops, promising that all the sacrifices would someday be worth it. I never doubted him. Years passed. One promotion at a time. We moved into a larger house. Then a better neighborhood. Then another house with a wide front porch and maple trees that turned brilliant shades of orange every October. Friends admired our success. They complimented Richard's determination. They often told me how lucky I was to have such an accomplished husband. I always smiled because correcting them felt unnecessary. Success had never belonged to only one of us. At least that was what I believed. Somewhere along the way the introductions changed. Richard no longer said, "This is my wife, Margaret. She has always been my greatest supporter." Instead he simply said, "This is Margaret," before steering conversations back toward quarterly earnings, corporate expansion, or executive travel. At first I assumed he was simply busy. Then I noticed little things. Invitations addressed only to him. Company dinners where spouses were encouraged to attend but I somehow learned about them only days before. Family photographs displayed in his office where I stood just outside the frame because the photographer had been asked to capture only the executive team. None of these moments seemed important by themselves. Together they quietly erased pieces of me until disappearing became almost routine. Even our children noticed changes they could not fully explain. One Thanksgiving our daughter Emily asked why her father interrupted me every time I tried to finish a story. I laughed and changed the subject because I did not want holidays filled with uncomfortable conversations. Looking back now, I wonder whether silence protects a family or slowly teaches everyone to accept what should never become normal. The orchestra continued playing softly while servers moved gracefully between tables carrying glasses filled with sparkling cider and trays of carefully prepared appetizers. Around me, conversations floated through the air about stock prices, vacation homes, and retirement plans. Nobody paid attention to the older woman sitting quietly beside the oversized floral arrangement. I had become remarkably easy to overlook. Yet despite everything, I did not feel angry. I felt tired. Tired of pretending that shrinking myself was kindness. Tired of believing that keeping peace required giving away pieces of my own dignity. I folded the linen napkin carefully across my lap and took a slow breath. Whatever happened tonight, I promised myself one simple thing. I would not chase anyone's attention. I would not ask Richard to acknowledge me. I had spent too many years waiting to be invited into rooms where I already belonged. Just then, a ripple of respectful silence spread across the ballroom. The senior executives who had been laughing only moments earlier immediately stood straighter. Every conversation faded at once. I lifted my eyes toward the entrance again as the distinguished older gentleman everyone had anticipated finally stepped inside, pausing for only a heartbeat before slowly scanning the crowded room as though searching for someone very specific. William Harrison did not rush into the ballroom the way powerful people often do. He walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. Conversations softened into whispers as executives stepped forward with eager smiles, each hoping to be the first to shake his hand. Richard immediately joined them, his posture straighter than I had seen all evening. Even from the back of the room, I recognized the practiced smile he reserved for people who could influence his career. He laughed a little louder than usual, nodded a little more often, and adjusted the cuffs of his tuxedo as though every tiny movement mattered. I watched quietly, not because I expected anything from the evening anymore, but because after so many years of standing in the background, observing had become second nature. Mr. Harrison acknowledged the line of executives with polite nods, yet something seemed to distract him. His eyes continued drifting beyond the welcoming committee, traveling across the ballroom one section at a time. It was subtle enough that most people probably missed it, but I noticed. He was not searching for the room. He was searching for someone. Richard extended his hand with confident enthusiasm. I could not hear his words over the orchestra, but I knew the expression well. It was the face he wore whenever opportunity stood directly in front of him. Mr. Harrison accepted the handshake briefly, exchanged only a few courteous words, then looked past Richard almost immediately. My husband turned slightly, following the direction of the older man's gaze. So did several vice presidents standing nearby. Their attention swept across tables filled with guests until, unexpectedly, every pair of eyes seemed to settle toward the back corner where I was seated alone. I instinctively glanced behind me, convinced someone more important must have entered through another doorway. There was no one there. Only a quiet hallway leading toward the kitchens. When I looked forward again, Mr. Harrison had taken his first step away from the welcoming group. One executive politely attempted to introduce another department leader, but the chief executive officer smiled apologetically and continued walking. Another senior manager offered to escort him toward the stage where the evening program would begin. Again, he thanked the man but declined. His pace remained calm, deliberate, almost thoughtful. Every conversation in the ballroom gradually faded as guests realized he was heading somewhere unexpected. Richard remained standing where he was for only a second before quickly following several feet behind, confusion beginning to replace confidence on his face. I lowered my eyes for a moment, assuming he would stop at one of the larger tables before reaching mine. There were board members seated nearby, major investors, and longtime company advisors. Surely someone else was the destination. I adjusted the sleeve of my dress and reached for the glass of sparkling water resting beside my dinner plate. My hands remained steady, although I could feel hundreds of quiet glances moving through the room like a gentle breeze. The orchestra slowly finished its song, leaving only the soft clink of silverware somewhere across the ballroom. When I finally looked up again, William Harrison was standing only a few feet away. For a brief moment he simply studied my face with an expression that was impossible to read. It was not surprise exactly. It felt more like someone opening a treasured photograph they had not expected to find after many years. His eyes softened, and a warm smile slowly appeared. I searched my memory, trying to understand why his face seemed strangely familiar. Age changes all of us in quiet ways. Hair turns silver. Faces gathered gentle lines earned through decades of laughter and disappointment. Yet something about his eyes stirred a memory that refused to become clear. Richard finally caught up beside him, slightly out of breath but still smiling professionally. "Mr. Harrison," he began, "if you would allow me to introduce." The older gentleman lifted one hand politely, not to dismiss Richard with disrespect, but simply to pause the interruption. His attention never left me. The silence that followed felt unusually peaceful rather than uncomfortable. Then he smiled even wider, and his voice carried naturally through the suddenly quiet ballroom. "Margaret," he said with genuine warmth, "after all these years, I was beginning to wonder if I would ever have the chance to thank you in person." The words settled over the room with astonishing weight. Every executive nearby exchanged puzzled looks. Richard's smile disappeared so completely that I almost did not recognize his face. As for me, I simply stared at the distinguished gentleman standing before my table, searching through memories that had remained untouched for decades, slowly realizing that this evening had already begun to change in ways none of us could have imagined. For several long seconds I could not answer because the name he had spoken had unlocked a door inside my memory that I had not opened in almost 4 decades. William Harrison looked older now, his dark hair replaced by silver, his shoulders carrying the quiet confidence that only time can build, yet his eyes were exactly the same. They were the eyes of a determined young engineer who had once walked into the public library every Tuesday evening carrying a worn leather briefcase filled with handwritten notes, financial reports, and dreams that seemed far too large for the small conference room where we first met. Before I married Richard, before children, before mortgages and corporate promotions became the center of our lives, I had volunteered at a community business development program organized by the city. It was never meant to become anything important. Local entrepreneurs could reserve a table, borrow research materials, and receive guidance from volunteers with backgrounds in finance, education, and public administration. I had recently completed my degree in economics and loved helping people organize complicated ideas into realistic plans. William had arrived carrying more determination than resources. His manufacturing concept was innovative, but his proposal lacked structure, his financial projections were incomplete, and every bank had already rejected him. Most people politely wished him good luck and moved on. I stayed after closing more evenings than I can remember, helping him rewrite presentations, calculate operating costs, and prepare answers for difficult investor questions. We drank countless cups of terrible vending machine coffee while spreading papers across old folding tables. Sometimes we worked until the security guard reminded us the building had already closed. William always insisted that one day he would repay every kindness. I laughed because I never expected repayment. I believed that when people are given encouragement at the right moment, they often build something that benefits many others. Several months later Richard received an unexpected promotion that required relocating across the state. We packed our belongings within 2 weeks. On my final evening at the library, William handed me a handwritten thank you letter and said he had finally secured his first investment meeting. I wished him luck, hugged him goodbye, and never imagined our paths would cross again. Life continued moving forward with astonishing speed. Children arrived. Careers expanded. Responsibilities multiplied. His name occasionally appeared in newspapers as his company grew, but eventually even those articles became lost beneath grocery lists, school events, family obligations, and ordinary life. Standing before me now, William Harrison seemed to remember every detail that I had quietly placed into the background of my own story. He smiled warmly. "You probably think I have mistaken you for someone else," he said gently. I finally managed a small smile of my own. "No," I answered softly. "I just never imagined we would meet again." A look of genuine happiness crossed his face. "Neither did I. But I never forgot the woman who believed in me before anyone else did." His words echoed across the silent ballroom. Around us I noticed executives exchanging puzzled glances. Several members of the leadership team looked toward Richard, expecting him to explain what they had just heard. My husband remained completely still. The confidence that had filled his expression only minutes earlier had quietly disappeared. William continued speaking with the ease of someone sharing an old family memory. "Do you remember those Tuesday nights at the library? You used to tell me that numbers only matter when they serve people." I have repeated that sentence in board meetings for years. I could not help smiling through the wave of memories returning one after another. "I cannot believe you still remember that," I replied. He laughed softly. "Margaret, some lessons shape an entire life. You helped me believe my company could exist when I had almost convinced myself to quit. A respectful silence settled over the nearby tables. No one interrupted. No one reached for a microphone or attempted to redirect the evening. Even the servers carrying dinner plates seemed to slow their pace. Richard finally stepped forward with an uncertain smile. I had no idea the two of you knew each other, he said, trying to sound relaxed. William turned politely toward him for the first time. Then you have been missing a remarkable part of your wife's story, he answered kindly. Because without Margaret Collins, there is a very good chance Harrison Global would never have become the company all of us are celebrating tonight. I lowered my eyes for a moment, overwhelmed not by pride but by the unexpected realization that the parts of my life I had quietly dismissed as ordinary had remained unforgettable to someone who had built an extraordinary future. The silence that followed those words carried a kind of weight I had never experienced before. It was not uncomfortable. It was revealing. The people standing around us had spent years studying quarterly reports, executive presentations, and performance reviews, yet they were suddenly discovering that one of the most important influences behind the company had never appeared in any official history. William Harrison gently pulled out the empty chair beside mine instead of returning to the head table prepared in his honor. The simple gesture caused another quiet ripple throughout the ballroom. No one had expected the chief executive officer to choose the least noticeable table in the room. May I sit with you for a few minutes? He asked. I laughed softly. You are asking permission at your own event? He smiled. Some people earn respect through their titles. Others earn it long before titles ever exist. I nodded, still trying to understand how an evening that had begun with me being hidden in a corner had somehow become centered around a conversation I never expected to have. Nearby, Richard remained standing beside us with an uncertain expression. I could almost see him trying to fit together pieces of a story he had never bothered to ask about during our marriage. William noticed him and spoke with genuine courtesy. Richard, would you join us? My husband hesitated before taking the remaining chair. It was the first time all evening that we had sat beside one another. For years, business dinners had often placed us at opposite ends of rooms, separated by conversations that never included me. Tonight, the distance between us felt much greater than a few feet. William looked at Richard kindly. Your wife has always had a remarkable gift. She never tried to impress anyone. She simply helped people become better than they believed they could be. Richard forced a polite smile. Margaret has always been supportive. The sentence sounded strangely formal, as though he were describing someone he barely knew. William turned toward me again. Supportive is too small a word. He folded his hands across the table, speaking carefully enough that nearby guests could hear without feeling excluded. During those evenings at the library, I arrived convinced that I would fail. Every financial institution had rejected my proposal. Every experienced investor found reasons to walk away. Margaret never promised success. She simply taught me how to prepare so thoroughly that opportunity would eventually recognize me. Several executives slowly gathered nearby, pretending to admire the floral arrangements while clearly listening. William continued with a quiet smile. She corrected every weakness in my business plan. She challenged assumptions that nobody else questioned. More importantly, she reminded me that character mattered as much as profit. I felt my cheeks warm slightly. You are giving me far too much credit. He shook his head. No. I simply spent 40 years waiting for the chance to give you the credit you deserved. Across the ballroom I noticed people looking toward me with expressions completely different from the polite indifference that had greeted my arrival. Earlier they had seen an older woman sitting alone near the back. Now they seemed curious about the story they had never heard. It reminded me how quickly public opinion can change once someone influential speaks. Yet inside, I felt surprisingly calm. I did not need their admiration. The greatest gift had already arrived. Someone remembered who I had been before I slowly convinced myself that my own contributions no longer mattered. Richard cleared his throat. Margaret never mentioned helping you. I looked at him with gentle surprise. You never asked. The words came out more softly than I expected, yet they settled between us with unmistakable clarity. Richard lowered his eyes for a moment. There was no accusation in my voice, only truth. Over many years we had talked about mortgage payments, children's schedules, retirement accounts, and vacation plans. Somehow we had stopped asking one another about the dreams, experiences, and chapters that had shaped us before our lives merged together. William leaned back thoughtfully. There is something I have regretted for many years, he said. As the company grew, I searched for Margaret several times. The library had closed, records had changed, and life moved quickly. I always hoped I might find her again simply to say thank you. I smiled. Life has a way of choosing its own timing. He nodded. It certainly does. Just then the master of ceremonies quietly approached our table, apologizing for the interruption. Mr. Harrison, everyone is ready for your opening remarks whenever you are. William stood slowly, then looked toward the stage before turning back to me. I think my speech may need one important addition. The master of ceremonies looked puzzled. So did nearly everyone standing nearby. William smiled warmly at me once more. For years I have spoken about leadership, innovation, and perseverance. Tonight I think it is finally time to tell everyone where those lessons truly began. I watched him walk toward the stage while hundreds of guests followed him with their eyes. For the first time in decades, Richard did not rush ahead to stand beside the most powerful person in the room. Instead, he remained quietly seated next to me, staring at the stage with the expression of a man beginning to realize that the woman he had spent years overlooking possessed a story far greater than he had ever taken the time to understand. William Harrison walked onto the stage without the prepared notes waiting beside the podium. He glanced at the folder, smiled to himself, and quietly set it aside. That single gesture immediately captured everyone's attention because executives who knew him well understood he rarely spoke without careful preparation. Tonight felt different. He rested both hands lightly on the podium and looked across the ballroom before his eyes found me again near the back of the room. Good evening, everyone, he began. Every year I stand before this company and speak about leadership, perseverance, innovation, and gratitude. Tonight I would like to begin somewhere else. The ballroom became perfectly still. Many people assume successful companies are built by brilliant ideas. They are not. They are built by ordinary people who choose to believe in someone before success exists. A few guests nodded politely, expecting another inspiring business speech. They had no idea where his story was leading. 40 years ago, he continued, I was a young man carrying a business plan that had been rejected more times than I cared to count. Banks declined my applications. Investors smiled politely before showing me the door. Friends suggested I abandon my dream and find stable employment. Looking back, they were probably giving practical advice. But then I met someone who asked me a different question. He paused briefly. She did not ask how much money I had. She did not ask who supported me. She asked whether I was willing to work hard enough to deserve another opportunity. I felt every eye in the ballroom slowly turning toward my table again. My first instinct was to disappear, yet something inside me remained surprisingly peaceful. William smiled warmly. Her name is Margaret Collins. A gentle murmur spread across the room. Several employees who had spoken with me only moments earlier looked genuinely surprised. Others quietly glanced toward Richard, who remained seated beside me without saying a word. William continued. Margaret spent countless evenings helping me improve financial projections, organize presentations, and strengthen ideas that I was too inexperienced to recognize. She challenged my assumptions without discouraging my ambition. Every difficult question she asked prepared me for questions investors would later ask. She expected excellence long before anyone considered me successful. He looked around the ballroom thoughtfully. When people congratulate me for building Harrison Global, I accept their kindness. But the truth is simpler. Every meaningful achievement rests upon encouragement received at exactly the right moment. The audience responded with respectful applause, yet William gently raised one hand, signaling that he had not finished. "There is another reason I wanted to share this story tonight." His voice became softer. "Throughout my career I have learned that some of the most remarkable people never seek recognition. They quietly strengthen families, communities, businesses, and friendships without expecting applause. Unfortunately, those same people are often overlooked because humility rarely demands attention." I noticed several executives lowering their eyes as though reflecting upon someone important in their own lives. William turned toward the leadership tables. "If you manage people, never assume the quietest person has the smallest story. Sometimes the individual speaking the least has sacrificed the most." The applause that followed was warmer and longer than before. It no longer sounded like polite appreciation for a speech. It sounded personal. When the room finally settled, William stepped away from the podium and walked back toward my table instead of remaining on the stage. Cameras followed every step. Employees instinctively moved aside to give him room. He stopped beside my chair with the same sincere smile I remembered from long ago. "Margaret," he said gently enough that nearby guests could hear, "I have spent many years accepting awards with my name engraved on them. Tonight I would like everyone here to know that gratitude sometimes arrives decades late, but it is no less genuine." He extended his hand toward me, not as a formal gesture, but as one old friend greeting another. I accepted it, and he helped me stand. The applause grew even louder, yet I found myself looking not at the audience but at Richard. His expression had changed in a way I had never witnessed before. There was no anger, no embarrassment, and no attempt to interrupt the moment. Instead I saw quiet reflection, as though he were remembering every dinner where he had spoken over me, every introduction where he had reduced me to a name instead of a person, every opportunity he had unknowingly allowed to pass without ever asking about the chapters of my life that existed before we met. For the first time in many years, he looked at me with genuine curiosity instead of familiar assumption, and I realized that recognition from the world was meaningful, but recognition from the people closest to us could change an entirely different part of the heart. As the applause gradually faded, the evening resumed its formal schedule, but nothing felt the same anymore. Conversations carried a different tone. People who had walked past my table without a second glance only an hour earlier now approached with warm smiles and genuine curiosity. They did not ask about my dress or where I lived. They wanted to know about the library, the early days, the young entrepreneur who had become one of the most respected leaders in the country. I answered politely, keeping every story brief because I had never been comfortable making myself the center of attention. William remained nearby for several minutes, introducing me to board members not as an honored guest, but as an old friend whose wisdom had quietly shaped his journey. Every introduction sounded remarkably similar. "This is Margaret Collins. I have wanted you to meet her for years." Each sentence reminded me that recognition is most meaningful when it comes from sincere gratitude rather than obligation. Richard stood beside me throughout those conversations, unusually quiet. Normally he would have guided discussions, filled every pause, and ensured that people remembered his accomplishments. Tonight he listened. More than once I noticed him studying my face with an expression I could not immediately understand. It was not guilt alone. It was the look of someone realizing there were entire chapters of another person's life that he had never bothered to read. Eventually the crowd began drifting toward the dining area as dinner was announced. Before returning to the head table, William gently touched my shoulder. "I hope you will not leave before we have another chance to talk," he said. "There are many stories I still owe you." I smiled. "I would like that very much." After he walked away, Richard remained standing beside me for a long moment before quietly asking, "Would you sit with me at the executive table?" The invitation surprised me more than anything that had happened all evening. Just a few hours earlier he had asked me to stay out of sight. Now he was asking me to sit beside him where every executive could see us. I looked toward the beautifully arranged table near the stage and then back at the simple place setting where I had spent the evening. "Why?" I asked gently. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, he seemed unwilling to answer with the easiest explanation. After several quiet seconds he said, "Because you belong there." His words were honest, yet they arrived decades later than they should have. I smiled softly, not with bitterness but with calm understanding. "Richard, I belonged there before tonight." He lowered his eyes. There was nothing harsh in my voice, which somehow made the truth even harder to ignore. We walked toward the executive table together in complete silence. Employees who had watched us enter separately now noticed us arriving side by side. Chairs were adjusted, conversations paused, and several executives greeted me warmly by name. One woman admitted she had worked with Richard for nearly 12 years and had never truly met me until this evening. "I feel as though I have been introduced to someone everyone should have known a long time ago," she said kindly. Her words lingered in my thoughts. How many people pass quietly through our lives because someone else decides their story is not worth telling? Dinner was served, but the conversations no longer revolved entirely around quarterly earnings and market forecasts. Several younger managers asked how I had evaluated business ideas before computers existed. Others wanted to know how small acts of encouragement could influence leadership decades later. I answered as honestly as I could. "People rarely become their best because someone praises them," I said. "They become their best because someone believes they are capable of more than they currently see in themselves." William looked across the table and smiled in agreement. Richard remained unusually thoughtful. He barely touched his dinner. Once, while others discussed an upcoming expansion project, I noticed him looking toward me again with quiet reflection. "Margaret," he said softly enough that only I could hear, "I cannot remember the last time I asked you about your dreams before we married." I met his eyes without anger. "Neither can I." We sat together in peaceful silence after that. There was nothing left to defend, nothing left to explain. Sometimes the greatest changes begin not with dramatic apologies but with a single moment of honest recognition. As I looked around the ballroom filled with laughter, conversation, and sparkling lights, I realized the greatest gift of the evening was not that influential people finally knew my name. It was that after many years of slowly becoming invisible, I had quietly remembered it myself. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere inside the ballroom had transformed into something far more personal than an executive celebration. Conversations no longer revolved around corporate milestones alone. They drifted toward family, mentors, second chances, and the quiet people whose names rarely appeared in annual reports but whose influence shaped countless lives. I listened more than I spoke. That had always been my nature. Yet this time my silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of someone trying not to take up space. It was the silence of someone finally comfortable with who she had always been. William returned to our table carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of me exactly the way he had done decades earlier in that little library conference room. "Still no sugar?" he asked with a smile. I laughed softly. "Some habits survive 40 years. He nodded. "The important ones usually do." Richard watched the exchange quietly before clearing his throat. "William," he said, "there is something I have wanted to ask ever since your speech." William looked at him with the same calm courtesy he had shown throughout the evening. "Of course." Richard hesitated for a moment. "When you became successful, why did you never mention Margaret publicly before tonight?" It was an honest question, and one I realized I had quietly wondered myself. William rested his hands around the warm coffee cup before answering. "Because Margaret never asked for recognition. I offered more than once to mention her during interviews in the early years. She always told me the same thing." He looked toward me. "Would you like to remind him?" I smiled as the memory returned almost immediately. "I told you that if your company succeeded, people should trust your leadership because of the work you did, not because someone else praised you." William nodded. "Exactly. She believed encouragement should never become a transaction." He paused thoughtfully before continuing. "But there is a difference between respecting someone's humility and allowing history to forget them completely. Tonight I realized I had waited long enough. Richard lowered his eyes again. I think I have done something similar, he admitted quietly. Not intentionally. But gradually. No one at the table interrupted him. Margaret spent years supporting every promotion I ever received. Every late night. Every relocation. Every difficult season. Somewhere along the way I became so focused on being recognized professionally that I stopped recognizing the person who made that success possible. His voice remained steady, but I could hear genuine regret beneath every word. I convinced myself she was simply always there. I stopped asking about her ideas because I assumed I already knew everything important about her. I reached across the table and gently rested my hand over his. Richard, I said softly, people rarely drift apart because of one terrible moment. They drift apart because of thousands of ordinary moments that slowly stop receiving attention. He looked at me with eyes that carried both sadness and relief. Do you think that can change? I considered the question carefully before answering. Only if both people choose curiosity over assumption. William smiled quietly, saying nothing. He did not need to. The conversation belonged to us now. Around the ballroom, guests gradually began preparing to leave. Goodbyes were exchanged. Business cards changed hands. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Several employees stopped at our table simply to shake my hand. One young analyst confessed that she had nearly declined a leadership opportunity because she believed she lacked experience. After hearing your story tonight, she said, I think I owe myself another chance. I wished her well and reminded her that confidence grows one decision at a time. As she walked away, William leaned toward me with a warm smile. You see? You are still doing exactly what you did all those years ago. I looked across the ballroom where staff members were quietly clearing tables and folding linens after another successful event. The room that had once made me feel invisible now seemed filled with ordinary people carrying unseen stories of their own. I realized that the greatest lesson of the evening had nothing to do with status, applause, or public recognition. Every person in that ballroom had arrived hoping to be noticed in one way or another. Yet what truly changed lives was not being seen by the crowd. It was being genuinely seen by even one person who understood your worth long before anyone else did. As Richard and I prepared to leave together, he reached for my hand without hesitation. It was a simple gesture, almost identical to the way he used to hold it when we were young, crossing busy streets with dreams that still belonged equally to both of us. For the first time in many years, it did not feel like we were walking out of the ballroom as an executive and his wife. It felt like two people quietly beginning a conversation that should never have been allowed to end. The drive home was quieter than any conversation Richard and I had shared in years, yet it did not feel empty. The city lights drifted across the windshield as though they were quietly marking the distance between the people we had been that morning and the people we were becoming. Neither of us reached for the radio. Neither of us searched for comfortable small talk. Some evenings are too important to be filled with ordinary words. When we pulled into the driveway, Richard turned off the engine but did not immediately open the door. The familiar porch light illuminated the front steps of the house we had built together over 3 decades. I looked at it differently now. It was never simply Richard's success. It had always been the result of 2 lives moving in the same direction, even when only one name had appeared on business cards and office doors. Richard remained looking through the windshield before speaking quietly. Margaret, I owe you more than an apology. I turned toward him without saying anything. He continued, choosing every word with unusual care. An apology is for a mistake. What happened between us was not one mistake. It was years of slowly taking your presence for granted. I stopped asking who you were because I assumed I already knew. I stopped introducing you with pride because I became more concerned about my own image than our life together. Somewhere along the way I forgot that the person standing beside me was never supposed to stand behind me. His voice never broke, but it carried the weight of genuine reflection. I reached over and gently rested my hand on his. Richard, tonight did not change who I am. It only reminded both of us who I have always been. He nodded slowly. I know. We walked into the house together. Nothing inside had changed. The framed family photographs still lined the hallway. The grandfather clock still marked each passing hour with quiet precision. My favorite reading chair still waited beside the living room window where I had spent countless evenings with a book while Richard answered late-night emails. Ordinary things often become extraordinary after perspective changes. Before going upstairs, Richard stopped in front of an old photograph hanging near the staircase. It had been taken during our first year of marriage. We were standing outside our tiny apartment, laughing at something neither of us could remember anymore. He smiled softly. That young man believed he could conquer the world because he knew someone believed in him. He looked at me. I think I spent too many years admiring what I became and not enough years appreciating who helped me become it. The following Monday morning brought another unexpected surprise. A bouquet of white lilies arrived at our front door with a handwritten note. It simply read, "Thank you for believing in possibility before success had a name. My gratitude will always remain greater than my accomplishments. Your friend, William Harrison." I placed the flowers in the center of the dining room table, smiling quietly. They were beautiful, but what touched me most was not the gift itself. It was the reminder that kindness offered without expectation can continue shaping lives long after we assume it has been forgotten. Over the following weeks, subtle changes began appearing in our daily routine. Richard started asking about the books I was reading. We took evening walks without discussing work. Sometimes we simply sat on the back porch watching the sunset, talking about memories we had somehow skipped over during the busiest years of our marriage. One Saturday morning he found an old box in the attic containing newspaper clippings, library certificates, and handwritten notes from my volunteer years. We spent hours reading them together. More than once he stopped and smiled with quiet amazement. "I cannot believe I never knew this." I answered gently, "You never asked." This time the words carried no sadness. They sounded more like an invitation than a regret. Several months later Harrison Global invited both of us to attend another company event. When we arrived, Richard did not walk ahead. He reached for my hand before we entered the building. At the reception desk the hostess smiled and asked for our names. Richard answered without hesitation. "I am Richard Collins," he said warmly, "and this is my wife, Margaret Collins. She is the most remarkable person you will meet tonight." I laughed quietly, feeling my cheeks warm with embarrassment. The young hostess smiled politely, unaware of why those simple words meant so much. As we walked into the ballroom together, I realized that respect cannot be created by applause, titles, or public recognition. It grows through thousands of ordinary choices to truly see another person. That evening months earlier, I believed I had been invited to a corporate celebration. Instead, I had been given something infinitely more valuable. I had rediscovered my own voice without raising it, my own worth without proving it, and my own place without asking permission to belong. Sometimes life changes because the right person remembers your name. Sometimes it changes because you finally remember it yourself. And in the end, that quiet recognition became the greatest success story of all.